what is effective or what makes for effective communication. And I have a few, let's just call them lessons now and give up on the thoughts. A few lessons that I think are important. One is data trumps intuition. And I think communication is one of the few scientific disciplines I'm fascinated where applications tend to lag behind what cutting-edge research is about 20 years. So where we still apply principles that are really not necessarily supported by current research. Where we're following models that 20 years ago were great models. But where we already have so much new research that we could do it so much better, but for some reason we don't just yet. And I'm sure there are many other disciplines, but I do think that for communication that's very striking. And so one of the things that I would argue very strongly is when it comes to effective communication, we need empirical data. We need to know who these audiences are, what are their concerns, what are the potential values that they apply when they look at information, and how does their processing work? And then, more importantly, how do you really reach these hard-to-reach audiences? Because not every audience member is equally easy to reach. In fact, some of them are very, very difficult to reach. And I mean, we're going through a primary season right now, or rather through a general election campaign soon, where this exact problem will be something that campaigns deal with on a daily basis. Maybe less so for information, but certainly for persuasive messages. Let me show you a few things that people have tried to do. This is about 2-week-old data from Pew, where they're saying, look, first thing that you need to think about, especially when it comes to politics, but certainly I'll show you for science as well, is the traditional media audience is over. It's dead, doesn't exist anymore. And they suggest that we break down the audience, and I'm not endorsing this, but I think it's a breakdown worth thinking about, into traditionalists, meaning your traditional news audience is the people who continue to be your traditional news audience. They tend to be less educated, they tend to be less affluent, they tend to still use local news and other outlets. But there are new segments that are coming out. Integrators, for instance. So people who are beginning to switch over, who read news both on and offline, who supplement their traditional diet with new media. And there's a third group that is fairly small, but highly educated and highly and very high income, that they call net newsers. So this is not my work, this is directly taken from the Pew. Why may this matter? Let me show you some data, and this is slightly rearranged from, and the effect is much better when you get the animations, but they don't work on this one. So this is slightly rearranged from the original Pew report. And what you see is if you compare these groups here, so these are the 3 groups, and then these are kind of the content that they're most interested in. And you see that decrease from traditionalists, really, they're the ones who are most interested in weather, most interested in crime, most interested in community news. When you look at the second set of 3 here, you see that for the traditionalists, they're really the lowest on culture and arts. They're fairly low on international news. But science and technology, that's already where you see that the beginning gap. So people who are interested in science and technology, you really find the highest percentage among people who almost exclusively turn online for all their news. And so we're beginning to see a shift where especially these boutique audiences are moving away from the media that we continue to focus on, and are turning to media where we don't really know all that much or don't have as much practical experience in terms of how to reach them. This is one, many of you will recognize these 2 faces, Barnaby Fader from the New York Times, business writer, and then at the bottom, and then Rick Weiss from the Washington Post. We've seen a trend over the last, I would say, 20 years where in the very beginning local papers got rid of their science writers. It was just not worth it because audiences didn't care. And then the mid-sized papers, the Sacramento Bee, the Milwaukee papers got rid of their science writers because it was just not worth it. And now we're seeing the Washington Post and the New York Times offering buyout packages to their science writers. And these were the latest 2 casualties of people who went and either went to think tanks or to divinity school and left their respective agencies. So we're talking about, in the Washington Post, for example, very explicitly saying, look, science is not our thing. Politics is our key market, given especially where we locally are. Again, from Pew, let me show you these 2 numbers here. This is where the age gap is going. The age gap in terms of older folks, television, and the internet and the age gap among younger folks in terms of no longer television, which used to be, and on average is still predominantly the medium that people turn to most, local news, but it's just barely number one, and it's quickly dropping because of that age gap and that cohort growing up, and that cohort, for lack of a better word, dying out. And so again, we're talking about data that will give us very clear directions in terms of how to go, where to go next, and how to move next. Lesson number 2. If we do good communication, we shouldn't favor elite audiences, and half of what we do does, unintentionally. Let me show you a few things. This is from the National Science Indicators. Either we favor them because of likelihood of exposure, and this is informal science communication. I put 2 things here: natural history museums, science and technology museums. The blue bar are college grads, so that's your highest educational group. It's already depressing given that it's below 40%, going once a year. So among the highest educated Americans, get about 40%. But the point of this slide, and the reason why I put it up here, is really the difference between the gray and the blue one. So the gap in exposure, simply the likelihood of actually being exposed to a nano exhibit in a museum, for instance, is much higher for the already information rich than for the already information poor. And so given where we put a lot of this information, we're simply most likely widening gaps simply based on likelihood of exposure. But number 2, and this is related to this, also in terms of mode of presentation. And I put here, very unfairly so, Nova Science in the New York Times Science section. But these programs are not made for your mainstream audience, or these pieces of news are not made for your mainstream audience. If you're wondering what the New York Times or who the New York Times is written for, open page 2 and look at the advertisements. And you know what the content is for, or who the content is for. It is not for a non-elite audience. It is written for a particular audience in a particular style, with the assumption that they know certain things that they need in order to understand it. The graph that I put here is why this matters so much, that mode of presentation, is the idea of knowledge gaps. And in the 70s, Phil Titchener and others and his colleagues at Minnesota did a lot of work on this. The idea that people learn differentially. It's not that high SES audiences, meaning people with high socioeconomic status, know more than others, which is true. But it's that they learn quicker from the exact same exposure. So in other words, if I have 2 groups read the same section from the New York Times, then what I will see is that elite audiences and high SES audiences will learn at a much higher rate than low SES audiences. And part of it is because of the mode of presentation, because these things are written for audiences that are interested in them, assuming certain pre-existing levels of knowledge and so on and so forth. So again, a lot of what we do unintentionally, and it's well-meaning, but unintentionally favors audiences that already know and widens gaps between the knowledge rich and the knowledge poor. A few solutions, and this is Bundesliga just started, as I'm sure you're all fully aware, soccer. So we're in the second week. This was actually from one of the opening games between Leverkusen and Dortmund, and Leverkusen being the former team, corporate team, of Bayer, or Bayer aspirin. And so the point not being boring, soccer is really boring, but the point being this. If we talk to audiences, and if we do advertising campaigns, if we do any type of outreach, this is a 40-meter banner on a soccer field. Think NFL. Think a banner like this in an NFL game talking about science for a better life, promoting either kind of a preemptive image campaign for science, or in general a general science campaign. So one of the key. There we go. Yeah, the Germans have I think gotten to the point where they understand English better than their own language, given how marketing works in Germany. But one of the things, and I called this here, taking it to their own turf. But that's in part the recommendation that I would make is go to audiences where they're looking for this information. I mean, you want to reach these audiences. This